When 15 stranded billionaires took refuge in her diner, Emma didn't know her life was about to flip like the snow swirling outside. The air smelled of burnt coffee and fear, the kind that hides behind expensive suits. "We'll remember your kindness," one man promised, but his smirk said otherwise. Still, she smiled, the kind of smile people mistake for weakness until it isn't. Because by sunrise, those same men would learn that debts of the heart can't be repaid with money. Subscribe now, or this might be our last meeting. Follow, comment, and share, so this story keeps finding you. The wind howled against the windows of Emma's diner like it was trying to tear the whole place apart. I stood behind the counter, wiping down the same coffee mug for the third time, watching the snow pile up against the glass. December 23rd. Mother Nature had decided to throw one hell of a tantrum. The weather forecast had called for light flurries, but this looked more like the apocalypse was rolling in dressed in white. Comment below where you're watching from tonight, because I have a feeling this story is going to hit differently depending on where you are in the world. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why location matters more than you think. I should probably tell you about my little dinner first. It wasn't much to look at. Just a small place on the edge of town that my mother had left me when she passed 2 years ago. 28 years old, and I was trying to keep alive a dream that felt bigger than me most days. The red vinyl booths were cracked in places the coffee machine made sounds like it was dying a slow death, and the neon sign outside flickered between Emma's diner and M's din depending on how the wind hit it. But it was mine, and it was home, and it was all I had left of her. The bank didn't care about sentiment, though. They'd been calling every week for the past 3 months, reminding me that the mortgage was overdue, that I had until the end of December to catch up. Or they'd foreclose. Every night I'd count the day's earnings, hoping for a miracle that never seemed to come. Tips from truckers and the occasional traveling salesman barely covered utilities, let alone the mortgage payment that felt like a mountain I'd never climb. That night I was alone with my thoughts and the storm outside. The last customer had left around 7, complaining about the weather and leaving a $2 tip on a $15 meal. I'd already cleaned the grill, restocked the sugar dispensers, and counted the register twice. $43.16. Not exactly enough to save the day, but enough to buy groceries for the week if I was careful. I was reaching for my coat when the knocking started. Not the casual tap of a regular customer, but urgent, insistent knocking that cut through the wind like someone's life depended on it. Through the snow-covered windows, I could make out shadows, multiple figures huddled together on my front steps. My first instinct was to pretend I didn't hear it. The closed sign was clearly visible, the lights were dimmed, and any reasonable person would assume we were done for the night. But then I heard voices muffled by the storm, but unmistakably distressed. Something about their cars, about being stuck, about needing help. I moved closer to the window and wiped away the condensation with my sleeve. What I saw made me do a double take. 15 men in what looked like expensive suits, some without proper coats, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Their breath created little clouds in the freezing air, and even through the glass I could see they were genuinely cold. Behind them, maybe 50 yards down the road, I could make out the shapes of several cars. Luxury cars from what I could tell. The kind that probably cost more than my diner was worth. They were scattered at odd angles, clearly stuck in the snow that had been falling steadily for hours. These weren't locals. Locals knew better than to drive expensive cars in weather like this. These were city people, probably caught off guard by how quickly the storm had moved in. My mother's voice echoed in my head the same words she'd said to me countless times growing up. "Emma, honey, always help others even when they don't seem to deserve it. You never know when kindness might be the most important thing you can offer." She'd lived by those words, always finding room at our dinner table for whoever needed a meal, always ready with a kind word for someone having a bad day. It's probably why the diner never made much money under her management either, but it's also why half the town showed up to her funeral. I looked at the register, at the pathetic pile of bills and coins that represented my entire day's work. Then I looked back at the 15 strangers shivering outside my door. They were probably rich enough to buy my diner 10 times over without blinking, but right now they looked just like anyone else would look, stuck in a blizzard with nowhere to go. The knocking came again, more desperate this time. One of the men had stepped closer to the door, and I could see his face clearly now. He was younger than the others, maybe in his 30s, with dark hair that was getting whiter by the minute from the snow. Unlike the others, who seemed to be arguing among themselves, he stood quietly patient, like he understood that begging wouldn't make the storm stop or the cars start. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I walked to the door, turned the lock, and pulled it open. The wind immediately tried to rip the door from my hands, sending a blast of frigid air and snow swirling into the diner. The 15 men looked up at me with expressions ranging from relief to barely concealed annoyance. "Please," the younger man said, simply, his voice cutting through the wind. "Our cars are stuck and the storm is getting worse. We just need somewhere warm to wait it out." I stepped aside and gestured them in. "Come on before we all freeze to death." They filed in one by one, stomping snow off expensive shoes and shaking ice from coats that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. I could smell expensive cologne mixed with the cold night air, could see the flash of gold watches and platinum rings as they settled into my worn boots. They looked completely out of place among the cracked vinyl and faded photographs of local high school football teams that decorated my walls. As I locked the door behind them and turned up the heat, I couldn't help but notice how they seemed to naturally separate into groups. Most of them gathered near the front, talking quietly among themselves with the kind of hushed urgency that suggested they were used to making important decisions quickly. But the younger man who had spoken first sat alone at the counter, watching me with curious eyes as I moved around the diner. "Coffee?" I asked, because that's what my mother would have done. "I've got a fresh pot, and something tells me we're all going to be here for a while." The blizzard seemed to sense we were all safely inside now, because the intensity picked up like some cosmic joke. Whatever these men had been doing out there, wherever they'd been traveling to on Christmas Eve, those plans were officially canceled. I started pulling mugs from behind the counter, already calculating how much coffee I had in stock. What leftovers remained from the dinner rush, whether my modest supplies could stretch to accommodate 15 unexpected guests until dawn. The thought of charging them never crossed my mind. In my mother's diner, hospitality came before business always. The younger man at the counter was still watching me work, and there was something different about his gaze. Not the entitled expectation I was already sensing from his companions, but genuine curiosity, maybe even respect. He seemed to understand that I was choosing to help them, not obligated to. "I'm David," he said quietly, extending his hand as I set a steaming mug in front of him. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, warm despite the cold he'd just escaped. "Thank you for this, really." There was sincerity in his voice that caught me off guard. Most people who looked like they could buy and sell my diner 3 times over didn't usually thank the help with such genuine gratitude. But before I could respond, one of the other men called out from across the diner. "Excuse me, miss, but how long until the roads are clear? We have important business to attend to." Important business? On Christmas Eve? In a blizzard? I glanced at David, who just shook his head slightly like he was apologizing for his associate's attitude. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know about the dynamics in this group. "Well," I said, turning toward the impatient voice, "unless one of you gentlemen happens to have a snowplow in your back pocket, I'd say you're here until morning at least. The county doesn't run crews on roads like this during active storms." The man's face darkened, and I could see him calculating something in his head, probably how much money this delay was going to cost him. But David spoke up before anyone could complain further. "We're grateful for the shelter," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Whatever you can spare, we'll take, and we'll compensate you fairly for the inconvenience." I was about to tell him that wasn't necessary when I caught sight of my mother's photograph on the wall behind the register. She was standing in front of this very diner the day she'd first bought it, wearing that bright yellow dress she always claimed brought good luck, holding the keys up like she'd just won the lottery. The frame was slightly crooked, and her smile was so wide it made my chest tight with missing her. Compensation or not, she would have done exactly what I was doing. She would have made sure everyone was warm-fed and comfortable, because that's what you do when people need help. Money was just paper, she used to say, but kindness was the only currency that actually mattered. As I moved around the diner, refilling coffee cups and taking requests for whatever food I could put together from what remained in the kitchen, I found myself studying these unexpected guests more carefully. They carried themselves with the confidence of men accustomed to having their needs met immediately, their problems as solved with a phone call or a signature. Yet here they were, completely at the mercy of weather and circumstance, dependent on the kindness of a small-town waitress they'd probably never have noticed under normal circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on me. For once, all their money and influence couldn't buy them what they needed most: a warm place to wait out the storm and someone willing to take care of them. Tonight, they needed me more than I'd ever needed anything from them. What I didn't know yet was that this reversal of fortune was about to become much more significant than any of us could have imagined. The kitchen had never felt smaller than it did that night, with me trying to stretch what little food remained into something resembling a meal for 15 hungry men. The dinner rush had cleared out most of my prepared dishes, leaving me with ingredients that required creativity more than culinary skill. I found myself moving between the grill and the coffee maker like some kind of midnight choreographer determined to prove that hospitality could triumph over scarcity. David had quietly moved from the counter to help without being asked. While his companions remained seated checking their phones and muttering about missed appointments, he was rolling up his sleeves and washing dishes in my small sink. There was something almost therapeutic about watching him work, methodical and careful, like he understood the value of the simple task he'd taken on. "You don't have to do that," I said, flipping what might have been the last decent burger patties in my freezer. "You're the customer here." He looked up from the soapy water, and I caught something in his expression I hadn't expected. Humility, maybe, or just genuine appreciation for honest work. "My grandmother used to say that the best way to thank someone for their kindness is to make their burden lighter, not heavier." His grandmother. There was a story there I could tell, but before I could ask, one of the men from the front booths called out again. Same voice that had demanded to know about road conditions earlier now, with an edge of irritation that made my teeth clench. "How much longer for that food?" "Some of us have been traveling since this morning." I bit back my first response, which would have involved pointing out that I hadn't invited them to travel anywhere, let alone through a blizzard on Christmas Eve. Instead, I focused on the plates I was preparing, arranging what food I had with the kind of care my mother had taught me. Even simple meals could be made special if you put thought into the presentation. "Almost ready," I called back, though what I really wanted to say was that rushing a cook had never made food appear faster in the history of restaurants. David must have sensed my frustration because he stepped closer to the pass-through window, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention. "Gentlemen, we're guests here. Emma is going above and beyond to accommodate us, and the least we can do is show some patience and gratitude." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. I could feel the dynamic shifting in the room, some invisible hierarchy being challenged. Whoever David was among this group, his words carried weight. But not everyone seemed happy about being reminded of their manners. As I carried the first plates out to the dining room, I started to piece together more about my unexpected guests. They weren't just wealthy. They moved and spoke with the confidence of men who were used to having their opinions matter, their decisions affect others. The expensive watches weren't just accessories, they were tools for men whose time was literally worth millions. The perfectly tailored suits weren't fashion statements. They were armor for boardroom battles. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, they were just 15 people who needed shelter, food, and warmth, depending on someone they would normally never notice to provide all three. I set plates down at each table, offering coffee refills and trying to read the room. Most of the men ate quietly, some making phone calls to cancel whatever plans they'd had for the evening. But I noticed they were watching me, studying the way I moved through the diner, the efficiency with which I managed to keep everyone comfortable despite being completely outnumbered and underprepared. One man, distinguished looking with silver hair that probably cost more to maintain than I made in a month, caught my attention as I refilled his coffee. "You run this place by yourself?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, not condescension. "Most day," I replied, topping off his mug. "My mother built this place from nothing, and I'm trying to keep her dream alive." "Built from nothing," he repeated like he was tasting the words. "That's admirable. Not many people understand what that actually means anymore." There was something in his tone that made me pause. He was looking around the diner with new eyes, taking in the worn but clean surfaces, the photographs of local families who'd celebrated milestones here, the handwritten specials board that my mother had started and I'd continued. This wasn't just a business to him anymore. It was someone's life's work. As the night wore on, I found myself in dozens of small conversations answering questions about the town, the diner's history, my own story. They wanted to know how long I'd been running the place, what challenges I faced, what my plans were for the future. Some of the questions felt invasive, like job interviews I hadn't applied for, but others seemed to come from genuine interest in understanding a world completely different from their own. David remained the most helpful and the most reserved. While others peppered me with questions, he simply observed, occasionally offering assistance, but never demanding attention. When I brought him his third cup of coffee, he looked up from whatever he'd been writing in a small notebook. "Can I ask you something?" he said, closing the notebook and giving me his full attention. "Sure." "Why did you let us in? You could have pretended you didn't hear the knocking. You could have claimed you were closed. Why take on 15 strangers in the middle of a storm?" It was a question I'd been asking myself all evening. The practical answer was that I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd turned away people who genuinely needed help. But the real answer was more complicated, tied up in everything my mother had taught me about the kind of person I wanted to be. Because, I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came, I believe that how we treat people when we don't have to treat them well says everything about who we really are. Tonight you needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. That's not complicated. David smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. "Your mother raised you right. She tried to," I said, glancing again at her photograph behind the register. "I just hope I'm honoring what she built here." What I didn't tell him was that honoring her legacy was becoming harder every month. The bills weren't getting smaller, the customer base wasn't growing, and the bank's patience was running out faster than my savings account. But none of that seemed relevant in this moment, with a diner full of people who needed exactly what I had to offer. As midnight approached, the conversation in the diner began to wind down. Several of the men had dozed off in their booths, exhausted from whatever business had brought them out in weather like this. Others were still on their phones trying to salvage what they could of their disrupted plans. But David remained alert, helping me clean up and prepare the diner for what was looking like it would be an all-night vigil. "I have sleeping bags in the storage room," I told him as we finished washing the last of the dishes. "They're left over from when the church used to hold emergency shelters here during bad weather. They're not luxurious, but they're warm." "I'm sure they'll be more than adequate, he said, and I believed he meant it. "Emma, I want you to know that what you've done tonight, it matters more than you might realize." There was something in his voice and intensity that made me look at him more carefully. In the soft light of the diner, with the storm still raging outside, he looked less like the successful businessman he obviously was, and more like someone carrying the weight of difficult decisions. "Are you okay?" I asked, because he looked like someone who needed asking. He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought he might not answer. But then he said, "I'm trying to be. Sometimes doing the right thing requires choosing between what's profitable and what's just. Tonight, watching you, I'm reminded which choice actually matters." I didn't know what to make of that comment, but before I could ask what he meant, he was already moving toward the storage room to help distribute sleeping bags. As I watched him gently wake his sleeping colleagues and help them get settled for the night, I found myself wondering what kind of business decisions kept a man like David awake at night. The diner grew quiet except for the occasional snore and the persistent howling of wind outside. I made one final round, checking that everyone was warm enough, that the coffee was still hot for anyone who couldn't sleep. As I turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow from the kitchen and the neon sign outside, I realized this was the fullest my diner had been in months. There was something profoundly satisfying about seeing every booth occupied, even if the circumstances were unusual. For one night, my mother's dream of this place being a refuge for travelers, a beacon of warmth in difficult times, was being fulfilled exactly as she'd envisioned it. I settled into the chair behind the register, pulling my mother's old cardigan around my shoulders and keeping watch over my unexpected guests. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on anything foolish enough to be caught in its path. But inside Emma's diner, 15 strangers slept peacefully, trusting in the kindness of someone they'd only just met. I had no idea that by morning, everything I thought I knew about kindness, trust, and the true cost of helping others would be turned completely upside down. Dawn arrived, like a reluctant guest creeping through the frost-covered windows with pale, hesitant light. I must have dozed off in the register chair sometime after 3 because I woke to the sound of hushed voices and the scraping of chairs being pushed back into place. My neck ached from the awkward angle, and my mother's cardigan had slipped down to pool around my waist. The 15 men were already stirring, folding sleeping bags with the efficiency of people accustomed to early mornings and tight schedules. Outside, the blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline silence. The snow had stopped falling, though the drifts against my windows suggested the cleanup would take days. "Good morning," David said softly, appearing beside my chair with a fresh cup of coffee. He'd somehow managed to look presentable despite sleeping on a diner floor, his hair only slightly rumpled. "You should have woken someone to take a shift. You didn't have to stay up all night watching over us." The coffee was perfect, strong and hot, exactly how I needed it after a night like that. "Old habit, I said, accepting the mug gratefully. My mother used to say that a host's job isn't finished until the last guest is safely on their way. Around us, the other men were gathering their coats and checking their phones with focused intensity. The spell of the previous night, that strange intimacy born of shared vulnerability, was already breaking apart like morning mist. They were transforming back into whoever they'd been before the storm had stripped away their usual contexts. I moved through the diner, collecting abandoned coffee cups and straightening cushions, trying not to eavesdrop on the conversations happening around me. But it was impossible not to hear fragments, mentions of meetings that would need to be rescheduled, deals that had been delayed, the inconvenience of having their carefully planned evening derailed by weather. "The road should be passable within the hour," announced the silver-haired man who'd asked about the diner's history. He was standing by the window phone pressed to his ear, apparently receiving updates from some kind of transportation service. "County crew started before dawn, and we'll have priority clearance." Priority clearance. Of course they would. Money had a way of making inconveniences disappear, even natural disasters. I found myself wondering what it would be like to live in a world where problems could be solved with a phone call. As I refilled coffee cups for the last time, I noticed that the dynamic among the group had shifted overnight. Where there had been a kind of forced collegiality the night before this morning, there were distinct factions, quiet conversations that stopped when I approached. Whatever business had brought them together was reasserting itself. David remained apart from these undercurrents, helping me clean up with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown the night before. But there was something different about him this morning, a tension in his movements that hadn't been there when we'd fallen asleep. Several times I caught him watching his colleagues with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Everything okay?" I asked him quietly as we worked side by side, loading the dishwasher with the last of the breakfast dishes. He paused, his hands still in the soapy water, and for a moment I thought he might confide in me. But then he just nodded and said, "Just thinking about the day ahead. Thank you again for everything you've done. It's been illuminating." There was something almost sad about the way he said it. But before I could ask what he meant, the sound of engines rumbling to life outside drew everyone's attention. Through the windows I could see a convoy of vehicles approaching, tow trucks, a snowplow, and what looked like a luxury van, all moving in careful formation down the freshly cleared road. The transformation was immediate and almost magical. Within minutes, the stranded cars were being freed from their snowy prisons, engines were starting, and the men who'd been my guests were becoming themselves again. Powerful, important, busy people with places to be and schedules to keep. I stood in the doorway, watching the organized chaos of their departure. No one seemed to remember the sleeping arrangements or the shared meals or the conversations that had stretched late into the night. They were focused entirely forward on reclaiming their interrupted lives. One by one, they climbed into their freed vehicles or the luxury van that had arrived to collect those whose cars needed repairs. Most offered perfunctory thanks, as they passed, the kind of polite acknowledgments people give to service workers, brief, generic, forgettable. David was the last to leave. He'd helped coordinate the vehicle recovery, making phone calls and directing the logistics with quiet authority. But as his colleagues pulled away, he lingered by my door, seeming reluctant to end whatever had begun between us. "Emma," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I want you to have this." He pulled out a business card, plain white with elegant black lettering. David Richardson, it read, followed by a title that made my eyes widen: Chief Executive Officer, Richardson Development Consortium. Below that was a phone number and an address in Manhattan. "I don't understand," I said, looking from the card to his face. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because what you did last night, the way you opened your home to strangers without asking for anything in return, that's rare in my world. And if anything unusual happens, anything that doesn't feel right, call me, day or night." There was urgency in his voice, like he was trying to tell me something important without actually saying it. Before I could ask what he meant by unusual, he was gone, climbing into the passenger seat of a black sedan that purred away down the road. I stood in my doorway until the last of the vehicles disappeared, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the snow, and the strange emptiness that follows when a place that was full suddenly becomes empty again. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, but hollow. Back inside, I began the process of returning everything to normal, folding the borrowed sleeping bags, and restoring the booths to their usual configuration. But something felt wrong, off in a way I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't until I went to check the register that I realized what was bothering me. The cash drawer was lighter than it should have been. Not empty, but noticeably short of what I remembered counting the night before. I recounted twice, then 3 times, but the numbers didn't change. Nearly $60 was missing money I couldn't afford to lose, money that represented groceries for the week. My first instinct was to assume I'd miscounted the night before, that exhaustion and stress had made me careless. But I'd been running this register for 2 years, and I'd developed habits that were hard to break. I always counted twice, always recorded the total. $60. Not a fortune by most standards, but enough to matter when you were living paycheck to paycheck and facing foreclosure. Enough to make the difference between making it through the week and having to choose between eating and keeping the lights on. I sank into the chair behind the register, David's business card still clutched in my hand, and tried to make sense of what had happened. 15 wealthy men had spent the night in my diner, men who probably spent more than $60 on lunch without thinking about it. Why would any of them steal such a relatively small amount from someone who'd gone out of her way to help them? But the money was gone, and they were the only people who'd had access to the register area during the night. The math was simple and depressing. I'd trusted strangers, and they'd repaid that trust by taking advantage of my kindness. The phone rang, startling me out of my spiral of doubt and suspicion. The caller ID showed a number I recognized, with Dread First National Bank, my mortgage holder. Miss Emma Peterson. The voice was professionally neutral, the kind of tone that delivered bad news with bureaucratic efficiency. Speaking. This is Margaret Chen from the loan department. I'm calling to remind you that your mortgage payment is now 36 days overdue, and we need to discuss your options for bringing the account current. I understand that, Miss Chen. I'm working on it. The holidays are always slower for restaurants, but January should pick up. I appreciate your optimism, Miss Peterson, but unless we receive payment in full by January 15th, we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings. January 15th. 3 weeks to come up with more money than I'd seen in months, money that had seemed almost within reach before $60 had vanished from my register. After I hung up, I sat in the empty diner holding David's business card and staring at my mother's photograph. She looked so confident in that picture, so certain that hard work and kindness would be enough to build something lasting. I wondered what she would have done in my situation. The morning light grew stronger, and gradually customers began to trickle in, regulars who knew my scheduled travelers who'd heard the roads were open again. I went through the motions of service, taking orders and pouring coffee. But part of me remained stuck in the previous evening, trying to understand how something that had felt so genuine could have been built on deception. It wasn't until late afternoon, as I was wiping down tables and preparing for the dinner shift, that I found it. Tucked under the coffee maker, almost hidden behind the sugar dispensers, was a small white rectangle I'd somehow missed during my morning cleanup. Another business card, this one for someone named Marcus Webb, senior partner at Webb Sterling & Associates. The law firm's name was familiar in the way that expensive things often are, but it was the handwritten note on the back that made my blood run cold. Thank you for your hospitality, it read in neat, precise handwriting. Your establishment would be perfect for our client's upcoming development project. We'll be in touch soon to discuss terms. Development project. I looked around the diner with new eyes, seeing it not as my mother's legacy or my home, but as someone else might see it, prime real estate in a location that could be valuable for the right kind of business. The kind of business that would require removing whatever was currently occupying the space. Suddenly, David's warning about unusual things made perfect sense, and I realized that the missing $60 might be the least of my problems. The 15 men hadn't been stranded travelers seeking shelter. They'd been something else entirely, and their night in my diner had been about much more than waiting out a storm. I stood alone in the gathering dusk, holding a business card that felt like a threat, and watching the snow begin to fall again outside my windows. For the first time since my mother's death, I wondered if kindness really was enough, or if some battles required weapons I'd never learned to use. Whatever was coming, I had the sinking feeling that my quiet life as a small-town diner owner was about to become much more complicated than I'd ever imagined possible. I woke up the next morning to a sound I'd never heard before in my life. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it didn't fade the way thunder does. Instead, it grew stronger, more persistent, until it became impossible to ignore. I rolled out of bed in my small apartment above the diner, pulled on yesterday's jeans, and stumbled to the window to investigate. What I saw below made me question whether I was still dreaming. Cars, luxury cars, stretching down Main Street as far as I could see in both directions, parked with military precision along both sides of the road. Sleek sedans, gleaming SUVs, sports cars that probably cost more than most people's houses. And they were all facing my diner. I counted them twice, then 3 times, because the numbers seemed impossible. 145 vehicles, each one immaculate, each one expensive enough to pay off my mortgage 10 times over. Their occupants stood beside them in perfect suits and designer dresses, all of them looking up at my building with focused attention. My hands shook as I pulled on a sweater and ran downstairs to the diner, my mind racing through possible explanations. None of them made sense. Normal people didn't organize car rallies at dawn outside small-town diners. Normal people didn't coordinate their arrival with that kind of precision unless something very specific was being planned. The moment I unlocked the front door, they began moving toward me like some kind of well-dressed army. Men and women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, all carrying briefcases or tablets, all walking with the confident stride of people who were accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Miss Peterson, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Walsh Industries. We understand you might be interested in discussing some business opportunities. Emma Peterson, Robert Kim Development Group. We'd like to make you an offer you'll find very attractive. Ms. Peterson, Sarah Martinez from Martinez Holdings. We have a proposition that could solve all your financial concerns." They kept coming, a steady stream of introductions and business cards and promises of prosperity that I couldn't process fast enough. My small diner filled beyond capacity with people standing shoulder to shoulder, all of them focused on me, with an intensity that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Wait," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the din. "Stop. Everyone just stop talking for a minute." The silence that followed was immediate and complete, which somehow made everything even more surreal. Nearly 200 people had just fallen silent at my request, as if I'd gained some kind of authority I didn't remember claiming. "What is this?" I asked, looking around at the sea of expectant faces. "Who are you people and why are you here?" A woman near the front, elegantly dressed with silver hair and expensive jewelry, stepped forward to answer. "We represent various investment groups and development companies, Ms. Peterson. We're here because we understand you're the owner of this property, and we believe it has tremendous potential for development." Development. The same word that had been written on Marcus Webb's business card. This wasn't a coincidence. This was coordination on a massive scale. "I'm not selling," I said firmly. "This diner isn't for sale. It belongs to my family, and it's going to stay that way." The silver-haired woman smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Miss Peterson, I don't think you understand the scope of what we're offering. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer, far more than this property is currently worth." "How generous?" I asked, needing to understand what I was dealing with. $3 million, said a man near the back. "Cash, today. $3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow, making my knees weak. $3 million was more money than I'd ever imagined, having enough to pay off the mortgage, buy a new place, start over somewhere else with more security than I'd ever known. But it was also the end of everything my mother had built, everything she'd dreamed of, when she'd first bought this little diner with her life savings. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why is this place worth $3 million to you?" The silver-haired woman exchanged glances with several people around her, and I caught something in those looks that made my stomach tighten. They knew something I didn't. "Location," she said finally. "This property sits at a strategic intersection that would be perfect for a large-scale commercial development. We're talking about a project that could transform this entire area." "What kind of commercial development?" I pressed. Another exchange of glances, more hesitation, and then a different voice from the crowd. "A casino and resort complex. State-of-the-art facilities, world-class entertainment, thousands of jobs for local residents. A casino." Suddenly, everything made sense. The secrecy, the coordination, the overwhelming financial pressure. They weren't just buying my diner. They were clearing the way for a gambling operation that would generate millions in revenue every month. My little family restaurant was standing in the way of a gold mine. And if I refused to sell, I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. The silver-haired woman's smile became even less friendly. "Miss Peterson, I think you'll find that refusing our offer would be a mistake. We have ways of making business ownership very difficult for people who don't cooperate with community development initiatives." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. These people had enough money and influence to make my life miserable if I didn't give them what they wanted. "I need time to think," I said, which was true, but also a stalling tactic. I needed time to figure out what was really happening, time to understand why David had given me his business card with instructions to call if anything unusual occurred. "Of course," the silver-haired woman said smoothly, "but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever." One by one, they began filing out of the diner, leaving business cards on every available surface as they went. Within 10 minutes, my small restaurant was empty again. But the evidence remained: dozens of cards scattered across tables and countertops. Each one representing a different company, a different offer, a different way of saying the same thing. "We want your land, and we're not planning to take no for an answer." I stood alone in the middle of my diner, surrounded by business cards and the lingering scent of expensive perfume, trying to process what had just happened. Yesterday, I'd been a struggling small business owner facing foreclosure. Today, I was apparently sitting on a $3 million piece of real estate that powerful people desperately wanted. I picked up David's business card from where I'd left it on the register counter and studied his phone number. He told me to call if anything unusual happened, and this definitely qualified as unusual. Before I could change my mind, I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting for my call. "Emma," he said, and there was relief in his voice. "Are you okay? Did they come to see you?" "They," I repeated. "You knew this was going to happen." "I suspected it might. The men who stayed at your diner the other night, they weren't just traveling together by coincidence. They were scouting locations for a major development project, and your property is exactly what they've been looking for. Why didn't you warn me more specifically?" There was a pause. "Because I was hoping I could convince them to find another location. I was hoping you'd never have to deal with any of this. But you couldn't." "No, I couldn't. Emma, these people have more money and political influence than you can imagine. They've been planning this casino project for years, and they're not going to let one small diner stand in their way. So what am I supposed to do? Just give up and take their money?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know that fighting them alone would be almost impossible. They have resources you can't compete with." Almost impossible. Not completely impossible. There was something in the way he said it that suggested he thought there might be another option. "David," I said, making a decision that surprised me with its certainty. "I want to fight them. I don't care how powerful they are or how much money they have. This diner meant everything to my mother, and it means everything to me. If there's any way to keep it, I want to try." The silence stretched so long that I thought he might have hung up. But then he said, "Emma, if you're serious about this, if you really want to fight them, then you're going to need help. Professional help and a strategy that they won't see coming." "What kind of help?" "The kind that fights fire with fire. The kind that uses their own tactics against them. But it's going to be dangerous, and there's no guarantee it will work." I looked around my diner at the photographs on the walls, at my mother's picture behind the register, at the worn but comfortable booths where so many stories had been shared. This place was more than just a business. It was a piece of history, a gathering place for a community, a legacy that deserved to be protected. "I'm serious," I said into the phone. "Whatever it takes." "All right then," David said, and for the first time since I'd met him, he sounded like someone who was ready to go to war. "Let me make some calls. This is going to get very interesting very quickly." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my quiet life as a small-town diner owner was officially over. Whatever came next was going to test everything I thought I knew about fighting for what mattered and about whether one person could really make a difference against impossible odds. The war for Emma's diner was about to begin. 3 days after the invasion of luxury cars, I discovered that having powerful enemies was like living with a constant headache. Every morning brought new problems. The health inspector showed up unannounced, finding violations that had never existed before. My food supplier suddenly couldn't guarantee deliveries. The local newspaper ran an editorial about outdated businesses holding back community progress that felt like a personal attack. They were making good on their threat, systematically dismantling the foundation of my business while maintaining a veneer of legitimate regulatory action. It was death by 1,000 cuts, professional and ruthless, in a way that left me feeling helpless and furious. I was scrubbing the grill for the third time that week, trying to meet new cleanliness standards that seemed to change daily when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the timing made me answer. "Miss Peterson. This is Janet Morrison from Channel 7 News. I'm calling about a story we're investigating regarding unusual real estate activity in your area. Would you be available for an interview?" I almost hung up immediately. The last thing I needed was media attention drawing more pressure from the people trying to force me out. But something in her voice stopped me, a note of genuine concern that felt different from the calculated politeness I'd been receiving lately. "What kind of story?" I asked carefully. "We've received documents suggesting that several major development companies have been using questionable tactics to acquire properties for a large casino project. Your name came up as someone who might have first-hand experience." Documents. Someone had provided evidence to a reporter, which meant someone with inside knowledge was willing to fight back against the casino consortium. "I might be interested in talking," I said slowly, "but not over the phone." We arranged to meet at the diner that evening. As I hung up, I found myself wondering who had contacted the media and why. The answer came sooner than I expected. I was preparing for the evening rush when David walked through my front door, but he wasn't alone. With him was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and the kind of focused energy that suggested she was used to solving complex problems under pressure. "Emma," David said, approaching the counter, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Chen. She's an investigative attorney who specializes in corporate fraud and land acquisition abuse." Sarah Chen extended her hand with a firm grip and a smile that managed to be both warm and razor-sharp. "Miss Peterson, I've been looking forward to meeting you. David has told me about your situation, and I think you'll be interested in what we've discovered." She opened a briefcase and pulled out several manila folders thick with documents. "For the past 6 months, I've been investigating suspicious real estate acquisitions throughout this region. What happened to you isn't isolated. It's part of a much larger operation that involves bribery, intimidation, and possibly fraud on a massive scale." I stared at the folders, trying to process what she was telling me. "You're saying other people have gone through this same thing? 17 families so far," Sarah said grimly. "Small business owners, elderly residents, anyone whose property sits in the path of this casino development. Most of them sold after experiencing the same kind of pressure campaign you're dealing with now. But some didn't sell. 3 holdouts besides yourself. 2 eventually gave up after their businesses were destroyed by regulatory harassment. The 3rd was found to have serious tax irregularities that resulted in criminal charges. He's currently in prison." The implication hit me like cold water. They weren't just trying to inconvenience me. They were capable of destroying my life completely if I continued to resist. "However," Sarah continued, "we now have evidence that those tax irregularities were fabricated. Someone with access to government databases created false records to frame an innocent man. That's a federal crime, and it gives us leverage." David leaned forward across the counter. "Emma, we think we can not only save your diner but expose the entire operation. But it's going to require you to be bait." "Bait. We need them to make a move that's clearly illegal, something we can document and use against them in court. Right now, everything they're doing has plausible deniability." Sarah picked up the explanation. "But if we can get them to offer you a direct bribe, or make explicit threats, or attempt to frame you the way they framed Robert Martinez, then we have them on federal charges that could bring down the entire conspiracy." I looked back and forth between them, trying to understand what they were asking. "You want me to refuse their offers and wait for them to do something obviously illegal?" "We want you to make them desperate," David said. "Desperate people make mistakes, and mistakes create evidence." It sounded reasonable in theory, but the practical reality was terrifying. These people had already demonstrated they could make my life miserable through seemingly legitimate channels. "What about the reporter I'm meeting with tonight?" I asked. Sarah smiled. "That was my idea. Janet Morrison has been investigating corruption in state government for years. She needs a face to put on the story. Someone sympathetic who's willing to go on record. And that would make them desperate. Public attention is the last thing they want right now, David explained. This whole operation depends on staying below the radar until all the properties are acquired. Media scrutiny could delay or even kill the entire project. I walked to the window and looked out at Main Street, trying to imagine it transformed into the approach to a massive casino complex. The vision felt like a betrayal of everything this town had been. If I do this, I said without turning around, if I go on television and make myself a target, what happens to me if your plan doesn't work? The silence behind me lasted long enough to provide its own answer. Emma, Sarah said finally, I won't lie to you, these people have resources that make them extremely dangerous, but they also have vulnerabilities. They've been operating in secrecy for so long that they've gotten careless. I turned back to face them, and they've underestimated me. They think you're just a small-town business owner who'll eventually buckle under pressure, David said. They don't understand that you're fighting for something bigger than money. That makes you unpredictable. Through the window, I could see the parking lot where the luxury cars had gathered 3 days ago. The memory of that morning still made my hands shake with anger. But I also remembered my mother in her yellow dress holding the keys to this diner like they were the keys to the kingdom. Okay, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I'll do it. I'll be your bait. When Janet Morrison arrived that evening, she brought a camera crew and transformed my quiet diner into something resembling a war room. She asked hard questions about the pressure campaign, the mysterious business cards, the overwhelming show of force from the development companies. I answered honestly, telling the story of the 15 stranded travelers who turned out to be advanced scouts, the army of investors who descended on my diner with threats disguised as offers. Why are you willing to fight this? Janet asked as the cameras rolled. $3 million is a lot of money to walk away from. I looked directly into the camera lens, thinking about everyone who might be watching, everyone who'd ever been told their dreams didn't matter as much as someone else's profits. Because some things aren't for sale, I said. This diner represents 30 years of my mother's life and 2 years of mine. It's where people come when they need comfort food and friendly conversation. You can't put a price on that kind of community, and you can't replace it with a casino. The interview aired 2 nights later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone started ringing with calls from customers expressing support from other business owners, sharing similar stories from people I'd never met who wanted to help. But the most important call came from Sarah Chen the next morning. Emma, she said, and I could hear excitement in her voice. They took the bait. We just intercepted communication showing they're planning to plant evidence of health code violations in your kitchen. They're going to stage a raid this afternoon. My stomach dropped. Stage a raid? They've bribed someone in the health department to discover contaminated food that they're going to plant in your refrigerator. It's exactly the kind of obvious frame job we needed to expose their methods. But what if it works? What if I get arrested before you can prove it's fake? That's not going to happen, Sarah said firmly. We'll have cameras recording everything and federal agents standing by to intervene if necessary. This is the evidence we need to bring down the entire operation. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the war for Emma's diner was about to reach its climax. In a few hours, I would either win my freedom and expose a massive conspiracy, or lose everything in a failed gamble against opponents who'd proven they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The afternoon sun was streaming through my windows as I prepared for what might be the last service Emma's diner would ever hold. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The morning of the staged raid arrived with a deceptive normalcy. I opened the diner at 6 as usual, prepared coffee, and checked supplies, greeted my regular customers with the same cheerful efficiency I'd maintained for 2 years. But underneath the routine, every nerve in my body was electric with anticipation. Sarah Chen had positioned her team strategically around the building before dawn. Hidden cameras recorded every angle of the diner. Federal agents waited in unmarked vehicles down the street. And a tech specialist monitored communications from a van disguised as a repair service. The first sign of trouble came at 11:30 when a black sedan pulled up outside and 2 men in expensive suits climbed out. I recognized one immediately, Marcus Webb, the lawyer, whose threatening business card I'd found behind my coffee maker. The other carried himself with the same predatory confidence. They entered with the swagger of men who believed they owned whatever space they occupied. Webb approached the counter while his companion positioned himself near the door, effectively blocking the exit. "Miss Peterson," Webb said, his voice carrying false warmth that made my skin crawl. "I hope you've had time to reconsider our generous offers. My clients are growing impatient." "I told your people already," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The diner isn't for sale." Webb's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I'm afraid that's no longer an option. You see, there are certain irregularities in your business operations that have come to the attention of the proper authorities." Right on cue, 3 official-looking vehicles pulled up outside. Health department officials, building inspectors, and what looked like federal tax agents began filing out, all moving with coordinated efficiency. "How convenient," I said, meeting Webb's gaze directly. "It's almost like you knew they were coming." "These things have a way of working themselves out," he replied smoothly. "Now, while they conduct their investigation, perhaps we could discuss a settlement that would be mutually beneficial." The health inspector entered first, a nervous-looking man who couldn't quite meet my eyes as he announced his intention to conduct an immediate inspection. Behind him came the building inspector, then the tax agents, until my small diner was crowded with officials. "This is highly irregular," I said loudly, making sure my voice would carry to any recording devices. "I've passed every inspection for the past 2 years. Why the sudden interest?" The health inspector mumbled something about anonymous complaints, but his discomfort was obvious. This wasn't his idea. That's when things started to go wrong for Webb. The health inspector opened my refrigerator and reached toward the back shelf, obviously looking for something specific. But instead of finding whatever had been planted there, he came up empty-handed, confusion written across his face as he searched frantically through containers. Webb stepped closer to the inspector, his voice low but urgent. "Check the meat storage area. You should find significant contamination in the ground beef." But there was no contamination to be found because Sarah's team had anticipated this exact scenario. They'd swept my kitchen during the night, removing any planted evidence and replacing it with perfectly fresh, properly stored food. The building inspector was having similar problems, unable to locate the structural violations that had apparently been reported. The tax agents found my books in perfect order, every receipt properly filed. Webb's composure began to crack as his carefully orchestrated frame job fell apart in real time. His voice rose as he spoke to the health inspector, no longer bothering to maintain pretense. "There should be evidence of rodent infestation behind the stove," he said urgently. "Check again. Someone reported seeing multiple violations." That's when I knew we had him. He was providing specific details about violations that should have been discovered by independent investigation, not directed by someone who already knew where to look. "Mr. Webb," I said loudly, "how exactly do you know what these inspectors should be finding in my kitchen?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and suddenly, every official in the room was looking at the well-dressed lawyer with newfound suspicion. "I think," said a new voice from the doorway, "that's an excellent question." Sarah Chen entered the diner with the confident stride of someone who held all the winning cards. Behind her came 3 federal agents in windbreakers marked FBI, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from intimidation to justice. "Marcus Webb," Sarah announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and civil rights violations." Webb's face went white as the federal agents moved to either side of him. "You can't prove anything. This is a legitimate business matter." "Actually," Sarah said, pulling out a tablet and pressing play, "we can prove quite a lot." Webb's own voice filled the diner crystal clear from the hidden recording devices that had captured every word of his conversation with the health inspector. His instructions about where to find planted evidence, his coordination with supposedly independent officials, his explicit threats. But the recording didn't stop there. As federal agents handcuffed Webb and his associate, the tablet continued playing intercepted phone conversations between casino executives, revealing the full scope of their operation, the systematic targeting of property owners, the corruption of government officials, the fabricated evidence used to destroy anyone who refused to cooperate. The health inspector, building inspector, and tax agents who'd been part of the frame job were taken into custody as well, their careers destroyed by their willingness to participate in corruption for money. "Emma," Sarah said, approaching me as the chaos swirled around us, "there's something else you should know. This investigation started because of you." "Because of me? Your television interview was seen by someone who'd been trying to expose this casino conspiracy for months. A federal prosecutor who'd been building a case but needed someone brave enough to go public. She gestured toward a woman in a severe black suit who was directing the evidence collection. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh. She's been after this group for 2 years, and your willingness to fight back gave her the opening she needed. Jennifer Walsh approached us, extending her hand with a smile that was both grateful and impressed. Miss Peterson, what you did took extraordinary courage. Thanks to you, they won't be destroying anything else for a very long time. As the afternoon wore on, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. 17 families had been targeted, but the investigation revealed evidence of similar operations in 3 other states. Hundreds of families had been displaced, dozens of small businesses destroyed, all to clear the way for casino developments. The most satisfying arrest came when David arrived around 4 o'clock, not alone, but in the company of federal marshals escorting a man I recognized from the original group of 15, the silver-haired investor who'd tried to intimidate me into selling. Robert Sterling, Sarah announced as they brought him through the door. CEO of Sterling Development Group and the mastermind behind this entire operation. Sterling looked around the diner with obvious disgust, his expensive suit wrinkled from what had clearly been a difficult day. When his eyes met mine, there was nothing left of the confident authority he'd displayed during his previous visit. Miss Peterson, he said, his voice hollow with defeat. I hope you understand that this was never personal. It was simply business. Sterling, I replied, thinking of my mother's photograph behind the register of the 17 families who'd lost their homes, of Robert Martinez sitting in prison for crimes he didn't commit. Destroying people's lives is always personal. As they led him away, David approached the counter where I was standing. Emma, he said, I owe you an apology. I should have warned you more specifically about what you were walking into that first night. Why didn't you? Because I was part of the group, even if I disagreed with their methods. I thought I could change their minds from the inside. I was naive about how far they were willing to go. But you chose the right side in the end. You made that choice easier than it should have been, he said. Watching you fight for something you believed in even when it seemed hopeless reminded me what integrity actually looks like. As evening approached and the federal agents finished collecting evidence, my diner began to return to something resembling normal. The tables were back in their usual positions, the register was functioning, and the coffee was still hot. But everything was different now. The threat that had hung over my business for weeks was gone. The casino project was dead-killed by the federal investigation and the public attention that had exposed its corrupt foundation. More importantly, 17 families who'd been forced from their homes would receive compensation. Robert Martinez would be released from prison and his record cleared. The corrupt officials would face justice for their crimes. The phone rang as I was cleaning up, and I answered to find Janet Morrison on the other end. Emma, she said, I wanted you to know that your story is being picked up by national news outlets. You've become a symbol of what one person can accomplish when they refuse to be intimidated. As I locked up the diner that night, I stood for a moment in the doorway looking out at Main Street. Tomorrow, it would still be a small-town street leading to local businesses and family homes. The casino that would have transformed it into a monument to greed would never be built. My mother's dream was safe, and more than that, it had become something larger than either of us had ever imagined. Emma's Diner wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was proof that kindness and courage could triumph over money and power, that communities could defend themselves against exploitation, that justice would eventually find its voice. The war was over, but the victory belonged to everyone who'd ever believed that some things were worth more than money. 1 year later, I stood behind the counter of Emma's Diner on a crisp October morning, watching the sunrise paint Main Street in shades of gold and amber. The view outside my windows had changed dramatically, but not in the way Sterling and his associates had planned. Instead of a sprawling casino complex, I saw something much more beautiful. A thriving community that had rediscovered its own strength. The first major change was visible right across the street where the old Henderson building had been transformed into the Martinez Community Center. Robert Martinez himself had cut the ribbon 3 months ago, his wrongful conviction overturned and his record completely cleared. The center now housed a legal aid clinic, a small business development office, and meeting rooms where local families gathered for everything from school fundraisers to town festivals. My own diner had evolved too, though the changes were subtle. The same red vinyl booths still lined the walls, and my mother's photograph still smiled down from behind the register. But now those walls also displayed framed newspaper articles about our victory letters from families across the country who'd been inspired by our story, and photographs from the dozens of small towns that had successfully fought similar battles. The morning rush was just beginning when the bell above my door chimed, announcing the arrival of my first customer. I looked up from the coffee I was brewing to see David Richardson walking in carrying a bouquet of yellow flowers that made my heart skip in a way that still surprised me. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, setting the flowers on the counter and leaning across to kiss my cheek. "How's my favorite small business owner this morning?" "Your favorite, huh?" I replied, arranging the flowers in a mason jar that had become their regular home. "I'll have to tell Sarah Chen you said that. She might be jealous." David laughed, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. Sarah had indeed become one of my closest friends over the past year, her legal practice now focused entirely on helping small communities fight corporate exploitation. The three of us had dinner together every Sunday, planning strategies for the nonprofit foundation we'd established. "Speaking of Sarah," David said, accepting the coffee I poured for him, "she called this morning with news about the Patterson case in Ohio. The casino group there just withdrew their development proposal rather than face the kind of federal investigation we triggered here. That was the best part of our victory. It had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, protecting communities across the country from similar schemes. The federal task force that had grown out of our case had now investigated and shut down casino development projects in 7 states, recovering millions of dollars for displaced families. The bell chimed again, and I smiled as Janet Morrison entered with her usual enthusiasm. The reporter had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation into the casino conspiracy. But more importantly to me, she'd become a regular customer and friend. "Emma," Janet said, sliding into her usual booth by the window, "I hope you're ready for another round of interviews. The documentary about your story premieres next month, and the producers want to do some follow-up pieces." I poured her usual coffee, still amazed by how much attention our small-town story continued to generate. The documentary, tentatively titled "The Diner That Saved a Town," would air on a major network and was already generating buzz at film festivals. The morning progressed with the comfortable rhythm I'd grown to love. Regular customers came and went, sharing news about their families and businesses. Mrs. Henderson stopped by to discuss the community center's upcoming fundraiser. Tom Bradley wanted to coordinate lunch specials with his hardware store promotion. Maria Santos, who'd opened a bakery in the space that used to house a chain drugstore, brought samples of her latest creation. This was what victory looked like, not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of hundreds of small interactions that rebuilt the fabric of a community. We'd learned that fighting corporate exploitation wasn't just about legal victories. It was about creating alternative systems that made communities stronger. Around noon, I noticed a familiar figure walking up the street toward my diner. It took me a moment to recognize him without the expensive suit, but when he got closer, I realized it was one of the original 15 men who'd spent that snowy night in my diner a year ago. He entered hesitantly, approaching the counter where I was wiping down surfaces. Up close, I could see that the past year had aged him considerably. His hair was grayer, his clothes were modest business attire worn by someone who could no longer afford custom tailoring. "Miss Peterson," he said quietly, "I don't know if you remember me. I was part of the group that stayed here during the blizzard." "I remember," I said, giving him my full attention. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "and to thank you." "Thank me for showing me what integrity looks like. For proving that there are still people who won't compromise their principles for money." He paused, gathering courage. "I testified against Sterling and the others. It cost me everything I thought I valued, but it was the first honest thing I'd done in years." I studied his face, seeing genuine remorse and something that looked like peace. "What are you doing now?" "Teaching," he said with a small smile. "High school business ethics. The pay is terrible, but I sleep better at night than I have in decades." When he left, declining my offer of free coffee and insisting on paying full price, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with victory, and everything to do with redemption. As evening approached, David returned from his office in the city, now permanently relocated to our small town. He'd sold his stake in the development consortium and used the proceeds to establish a foundation that provided low-interest loans to small businesses in rural communities. "How was your day?" he asked, settling into the booth where we'd taken to sharing dinner most evenings. "Good," I said, bringing him a plate of pot roast. "Peaceful. Normal." "Normal is good," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "You've earned a little normal." As we ate, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, I'd been a struggling small business owner facing foreclosure, wondering if kindness was enough to sustain a life built on principles rather than profit. Tonight, I was a successful restaurant owner, a nationally recognized advocate for small business rights, and a woman who discovered that love and integrity could coexist with financial security. The diner itself had become more than just a restaurant. It was a meeting place for community organizing, a symbol of resistance against corporate exploitation, and a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. After David left for his apartment above the hardware store, I completed my closing routine with the satisfaction of someone whose work had meaning beyond mere survival. I counted the day's receipts, noting with quiet pride that the diner was now profitable enough to support not only my own livelihood, but also the scholarships I'd established for local students. Before turning off the lights, I stood for a moment in front of my mother's photograph, the image that had sustained me through the darkest moments of the previous year. She was still wearing that bright yellow dress, still holding those keys like they unlocked the secrets of the universe, still smiling with the confidence of someone who believed that hard work and kindness could build something lasting. "We did it, Mom," I whispered to the photograph. "We saved your dream, and it grew into something even bigger than you imagined." I turned off the lights and locked the door, stepping out into the cool October evening. Main Street stretched before me, lined with locally owned businesses, family homes, and the dreams of people who'd chosen community over convenience, principle over profit. The casino that would have transformed this street into a monument to greed would never be built. Instead, we'd built something much more valuable, a community that understood its own worth, a legal precedent that protected other communities, and a story that proved ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment above the diner, I carried with me the satisfaction of someone who discovered that the greatest victories aren't won in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the daily choices we make about what kind of world we want to create. The 15 billionaires who'd sought shelter in my diner that snowy night had been looking for a place to wait out a storm. What they'd found instead was a woman who refused to let their storm destroy everything she held dear. And in the end, that single act of defiance changed everything. Not through anger or wealth or power, but through something far quieter, far stronger. Some victories aren't written in headlines or sealed with applause. They happen in small diners between chipped mugs and the hum of an old coffee machine, where ordinary people choose integrity over convenience and compassion over compromise. That night, as I turned off the lights and felt the warmth linger in the silence, I realized the truth my mother had always known: kindness isn't weakness. It's the highest form of strength. If you believe that too, subscribe, share, and let this story reach more hearts. Because the world could always use another reminder that justice begins with simple acts of good.